So I think the quick way to say it is this is a spin-off paper for me. That was a Festschrift this year for Richard Lanigan, is celebrating all of his contributions, his establishment, what's known as the ICI, the International Communicology Institute, and he also has created his own work known as semiotic phenomenology. And I was invited on to that, and I wrote, I guess I'll just say it, an exceptionally technical paper for that. It was written for people who are experts in semiotics, in linguistics, in intersemiotic theory, and I was really excited to be involved in the project, but it more than anything convinced me of the need to try as best I could to bring some of these, I'll say, very erudite, complex ideas about linguistics, semiotics, and the history and evolution of consciousness, as well as I could, to wider audiences and hopefully to a bigger public. And so what I'm trying to do here in this paper, as I say, is kind of doing a spin-off of the larger, more robust paper that I did for him. Now, I think the simplest way for me to convey what the project is, or what it is that I'm sort of after, is I'm trying to give a big history, evolutionary account of what it is that we mean by human language, what are the particular characteristics that make human language different than animal sign systems, and how exactly has alphabetic literacy, modern alphabetic literacy, altered that, changed that, sort of institutionalized some of these dynamics. Now, one of the ways that I would suggest that we can really understand this is to begin with these concepts that largely come out of phenomenology, but this issue of apresentation. And the three dominant themes to look at across all of the things I'm going to be talking about today. One would be this variation between context dependence and context independence. There's how much can something be independent of context and how much does it always get its value from its context. I think we can see, colors, just as a very simple example, they're more context dependent than we sometimes realize. They can change their hue or their shade just by changing the lighting or the colors that they're next to. The next one is part and whole relations, that we have variable ways of dividing up parts and wholes, so if I hold the pen in my hand, I'm holding here, I got my three fingers sort of pinching it. It seems at one sense like I'm holding a thing, the pen. It looks like it's a whole. But then the more I ask that, I say, well, wait, no, I just said my three fingers are holding it. So there's like a me, and then my fingers, and then the hand. Okay, you just bracket that. You say, okay, there's just the pen. But then when I say it's just the pen, I end up going, well, wait, no, there's the plastic, there's the ink, there's the tip, there's all kinds of parts that it's made up of. But then if I say, well, wait, no, I want to get back to just it as a whole, on the other end, it doesn't work either because I end up needing paper there's something I have to write on, and there's something I have to say that I want to maybe convey to others who aren't here present. So there seems to be this escalating parts and wholes that we deal with perceptually, and one of the most, I guess, important insights across this is that there are forms of variance and invariance that keep showing themselves in our experience of parts and wholes. Now, the two most classic examples come from Edmund Husserl. One would be of a three-dimensional cube. Now, it's not really a three-dimensional cube, but it's a pretty thick, fat, old phone here. One of the things that you'll notice about a three-dimensional cube is that no matter how I rotate it or try to change my perspective on it, I can only see at a maximum 3 sides at a given time. And that's true for all of us. All of us have a situatedness that allows us, again, to rotate it, vary perspective on it. And I think what Husserl wanted to say is that the sides that you're not currently empirically seeing, they're not there, they're apresented. And they're apresented, and that's what gives this object its three-dimensional depth, its thickness, the kind of inner subjectivity that allows us to, I guess, imagine what other people could be seeing when they see it. But the object as a whole is a whole because of eidetic elements, that is, elements that are absent to the empirical awareness. Now, take one that's, rather than just a fully spatial object which we rotate and vary, consider something like a melody. Now, a melody it unfolds over a sequence of time, and it's made of different notes. Now, the notes, they appear in the auditory field, and then they subsequently sort of vanish from the field, but you experience the whole of the melody because of an eidetic retaining that awaits. That is, the notes that have gone by are still retained in consciousness, just as the notes that are about to be played are in a sort of anticipation. And that's what makes the melody a whole, even though the whole of the melody is never isolated within the empirical field at a given moment. These basic processes of Gestalt psychology, of our perceptual awareness, I think if people don't think about these, haven't ever really come to terms with them, they'll really never have an adequate basis for understanding what language is and how language grew out of that. Okay, so the question then is, how did language grow? And what do we mean by language? What exactly was it? What I'm going to try to say and been trying to suggest over the course of these papers is that the evolution of consciousness, what we mean by human consciousness, is basically the growth and the depth of the paradigmatic axis. The growth and the depth of the paradigmatic axis. So again, this is going to take many moments here to explain this. So I think we need to begin with the fact that there are lots of different kinds of vocal utterances, lots of ways of making sounds and communicating, but not all of them are denotative utterances. That animals give warning cries, territoriality displays, mating calls. People can even use statements like, come here, go away. None of those are denotative propositions. No, what we mean by language is language, in the specifically human sense, makes possible denotative propositions. And so what is it that made denotative propositions possible evolutionarily? Well, Gregory Bateson says what you need to do is go back and look at mammalian play. That is, when you go and you look at mammals, although they're not giving true statements about the world, they are able to meta-communicatively frame their behavior. And so one monkey's there, and instead of biting, one monkey nips the other. He nips it in a playful way. And Bateson says, look, the nip means the bite, but doesn't mean what the bite would mean. And Basic's saying, see, look, this is the beginning of animal codification schemes. That is, this is the early beginning of the growth of the paradigmatic axis. When I say it's the growth of the paradigmatic axis, what I'm saying is that it's a possible repertoire of responses that are of a different logical type than those at the immediate action of the organism. Again, it's not a mating call, it's not a warning cry, it's the simulation of one. It's about it and not it, right? Again, it's a different logical type. Now, the history of denotation as this occurs, I think Suzanne Langer is probably one of the most robust accounts. She gives some of the most robust accounts of how denotation is unique and how it very likely evolutionarily occurred. I think one of the things that we can see is that we're getting lots of forms of eidetic hauntings of absences. And by that I mean the more that you move to information that's denotative, the more that you have to deal with the invariant rather than the variance. That is, people become less and less concerned with information that's at the variant level, but it's at the invariant. So what happens is an empirical eidetic doublet occurs for all things and words. So take this. I have a pen here rather than a pencil, but the word pencil somehow becomes made eidetic as it becomes denotative. By that I mean you learn to ignore and discount all of the varieties of pronunciation, all of the inflections, the way different volumes, different pitches. And so somebody could say pencil, 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 and you hear the same word there. You hearing the same word across those different pronunciations, that's the beginning of the invariant paradigmatic level. That's, again, this is the setting in of consciousness evolutionarily for humans. Now notice, when the denotative word occurs, the eidetic empirical doublet happens on both ends. Not just the word pencil, but this object. I got a pen. Not just the word pen, but what I'm holding. See, I could say what I'm holding is a particular. It makes a noise. It's sort of unspeakable, only showable. But once I call it a pen, when I call it a pen, now I'm recognizing it as in the category of pens, which means now I'm discounting the different shapes and colors and sizes of all the pens that are also pens. And I'm, again, honing in on this invariant feature of the object that I'm holding. Now, earliest forms of denotation, again, we sort of deal with that simple problem of the empirical eidetic doublet of any word, that is the denotative word, as opposed to the warning cry or the scream or the, there's lots of forms of interaction where the tone and the pitch is what the signal is about. Denotative utterance is about disambiguating that and getting to the invariant behind it. It's about information transfer in some way. Now, the two wonderful examples that Suzanne Langer offers in her account Language from Philosophy in a New Key, she says here, you want to understand the difference between a denotative proposition and other forms of utterance? Consider these. And she grants symptomatic expressions to higher primates, but she says, look, they're not denotative. So if you take the one on the left, yum yum, yum yum is not a denotative expression. It's a symptomatic expression of my feelings, my emotional state, maybe my regard for the object of attention. Very different than banana today. Banana today makes a statement. There's a propositional claim, and we can ask the question, is that true or is that false? Again, notice, denotative propositions are a proposition for which it has propositional content, and it's for which we can ask the question, is that true or is that false? Come here, go away, eek. None of those are denotative propositions. Banana today is. I'll take this one. Now here's a sort of interesting one. She's talking about the person who's emoting the love while they're in the feeling versus a person who's able to think about that feeling now that the situation has changed. Again, another characteristic of denotative propositions. So one is my love, my love. Yeah, the my love isn't a denotative proposition. It's a symptomatic statement of the emotional state of the speaker. She loves me not. The referent stays the same despite the radical change in emotions that I have. It's an increased degree of context independence, a new level of invariance being recognized in the sign systems. Okay. Now, predication. Predication is a peculiar form of denotative proposition, and we're really sort of building up to what we're going to try to get to, the syntagmatic and paradigmatic axis as they were discovered in linguistics. So sort of this building up to this. But, Korzybski, general semanticists, I guess the E prime crowd, Borland, people have been very critical of is, and they say, oh, get rid of is offers, confusions and reifies and whatnot. And I think there's a lot to be said. I think anyone who wants to learn about E prime would be well advised to practice it and learn about it. But there's another story to be told, and we want to see it both and, that's more complex than that. In phenomenology, for example, the is known as the copula, and it allows predication. What this means is that we're going back to that whole sense of part, whole, variance, invariance, and context independence issue again here. Look at this. I can say the ink is black. With the word is, the copula, I take apart what no physical capacity could ever do. I'm able to, in linguistic space, imagine the ink independent of the color, and I'm able to imagine the color black independent of any particular ink. That is, it releases those denotative parts, those concepts, fortifying the paradigmatic axis, building in resources for possible substitutions at a future date. But even that, I take something like the sound is loud. When I say the sound is loud, I'm imagining the sound independent of the volume, and it's almost like I'm imagining that there could be such a thing as a volume independent of any particular sound having a volume. That's what the language enables us to do, right? That's what the word is enables us to do. So, all of this, I guess, these various things, these utterances, the discovery of propositions, they go back to the ancient world, but it was modern linguistics where this became a modern science. And it was around the 1880s, I can't think of the guy, Krusevsky, I think was his name, who first developed him, but it was Saussure. Saussure largely, right around the 1911, 1919, got this off the ground as the basic understanding of the two associative laws that make translation, paraphrase possible. Is what are the undergirding, again, associative laws of discourse that make possible, again, translation and paraphrase. So, and this was largely developed. I mean, I think the best statement of this is so much comes from Roman Jakobson's work. Roman Jakobson gave so many useful critiques to Saussure, and this was developed most succinctly in a book by Elmar Holenstein called Roman Jakobson's Approach to Language, which I think is one of the most important books for people who want to understand any of this. And it's also a key book for Richard Lanigan. Lanigan himself has taken this model and adopted it into countless publications and applied it in many different ways. So here's this, this is, I guess, probably obviously, this is the most complex slide that I have here. Here's what the argument is, that as communication is occurring, it's occurring on two axes. There is a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. Again, a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. The horizontal axis is the syntagm, the syntagmatic relations, and it says that words gain their meaning by the combination they have, the contiguity they have, the total context in which they find themselves, and it largely deals with the items that are present, that is, they're in presentia. It accounts for the way language changes because we can, through new combinations of new words, create new meanings, and again, it sort of happens horizontally. Now, as I said, the paradigmatic axis, this is what in some way grew and was fortified historically, first through mammalian play, then through denotation, predication, denotative propositions, and ultimately into what we know today as language. In some way, the paradigmatic axis is the robust history of all of those possible elements that could be selected from, substituted because they're similar. Note, the paradigmatic axis is in absentia. It's in absentia. That is, it's not empirically present. It's part of the eidetic element. If the syntagm is occurring like an iceberg, the paradigmatic is the proverbial depth beneath that's holding it up by all of the absent but possible relations that could be substituted in. Otherwise, language would collapse. If all of the elements of the code had to be present within a given message, the message would collapse. It would fall in on itself. Right? Okay, so let me give you a bunch of examples of these. So here's a very simple example of the relationships between paradigmatic and syntagmatic relations. Right? So if I say, I see your point, and then I see the point of a spear. You can notice here that the words I see your point in the first one, not only do you get the meaning of the words point and see only by the combination of the words that they're in, that is, it's not as if each word just has a meaning. No, there's a syntagmatic relationship that allows us to know that the word see in that first one means what? Understand. What else does it mean? Agree. And how about point? What does point mean? Idea, proposition, statement. Okay, how about this next one? I see the point of a spear. Now, that one, what does see mean there? Visually. It could mean I understand, like I could see the point of a spear. Okay, I understand the idea of having a spear. You're very good. How about point?
It's a different dimension from the first one. First one is put in the sense of I see what you're trying to say. The other one is I see something there empirically.
Empirically, that you could point, you get poked with, right? That word. Now notice the syntagmatic, what was there in presentia, what we all just did in paraphrasing, trying to deduce what was absent but could be substitutable, were paradigmatic substitutions. That is, what makes an expression intelligible isn't simply the words that are present, but it's the absent words that people could see them as substitutable in there. Some of this is just blatantly obvious. All words are defined by other words. I mean, it's almost so obvious it almost washes over us, right? So let's take a more robust example here. Here's a classic example of paradigmatic substitution, right? The man walked down the street. So if I say the man walked down the street, this could be paraphrased in a lot of different ways, especially if we include the extra semiotic visuals that let us know who this person was when we sort of see it. That could be paraphrased as Mr. Smith went down the avenue. It said, her uncle strolled down the road. Some guy meandered up 43rd. A human moved through space. Now, we could say, yes, the meaning changes in some significant way, and we want to be able to change that meaning depending upon context to be more precise or less precise. But there's another sense in which what we're interested in when we mean comprehension is the invariant behind the variance. Imagine somebody says something to you, and then you say back to them exactly what they said. They always look at you with this, do you really understand? You know? But if somebody says something to you, and then you say it back to them in disguised form, but they can tell no matter how the expression is a little different, you get it, that's what we're talking about. That is, the paradigmatic axis is consciousness. It's the depth of the thick, absent, but possible relations which could be bore upon any linguistic statement. So, now, it's always fun to ask people. People like to say, well, can there ever be a syntagmatic change that doesn't have a paradigmatic change? Sort of like this argument. And syntagmatic, paradigmatic work has been done on clothing. You can talk about dinner arrangements. You know, you can talk about like clothing. You ask, do the clothing match? Does this tie match these pair of pants? That's a syntagmatic. If I say, should I substitute this tie for another tie? That's a paradigmatic, right? Again, substituting for a similar rather than does it fit in with something else. But sometimes people like to ask the question, can you ever have a non-paradigmatic change where you're just going to rearrange the syntagm? And I think there are ways where you can try to do it, but I'm going to try to show how even that doesn't work. And we're going to try to show, this is this point of it, there's a synergism. It's a paradigmatic and syntagmatic synergism. So take these two expressions. The dog tried to eat the man versus the man tried to eat the dog. Now, those have the exact same words in them. There have been no paradigmatic substitutions. The same elements are simply reordered and rearranged. And yet, they do more than just mean the opposite thing. They do more than mean the opposite thing. One, it makes it look like the difference is simply who's doing the biting and who's being eaten. And yet, the more you think about it, I think the word tried takes on a different meaning in that second sentence. Because dogs, in some cultures, paradigmatically mean food, and in other cultures, they paradigmatically mean pet. And so the absent, haunted, substitutable element that would be brought by a given cultural member could be very different at the paradigmatic axis there. Does everybody see that? That is, when we say the dog tried to eat the man, I think we're imagining like the dog attempting to chase down and eat this person, right? But when we do the man tried to eat the dog, now you could try to imagine a guy on all fours chasing the dog down, but you might imagine something like the guy morally, willingly was going to put the food to his mouth but couldn't do it. Or you could say the man swallowed the dog but it came up. See, right? Again, there's paradigmatic substitutable that are absent there. And again, I don't know if we get that same sense of the dog having a moral dilemma in its eating. So even the word tried strikes down a different paradigmatic set of relations once the syntagmatic axis has been altered, right? Okay. Now, this was the major model that was developed by Jakobson, and it's probably one of the most important models of communication, not to be confused at all with the chance, the message channel, sender, receiver kind of stuff. This is the functions that needed to be present and the elements there. And what I want to do here, I'm going to come back to that in just a second, but here's what that looks like. The argument that I'm trying to give in the paper is what communication looked like prior to denotative extra-linguistic syntagmatic relations. So if we're trying to understand the evolution of human communication, and I do think human communication went on for millions of years probably before denotative utterance occurred, right? So when we talk about denotative utterance, when did that happen? 100,000 years ago? Could it happened 40,000? I'm not sure. I think there's going to be a great argument there, but people were certainly communicating well before they were given denotative utterances. In fact, I mean, fire use goes back about a million years. Tool use goes back about 2.5. So I think there's obvious communications going on. Is it denotative? That is it propositional statements about the world that we could ask, is it true or is it false? No, I think what you have is something like this. You have syntagmatic relations. You have relations of the addresser and the addressee having emotive and connotative. If anything, the message is metacommunicative. This is, again, the early repertoire of metacommunicative framing in the organism. When you get to full human language, you add on those three different functions of referential, poetic, and metalingual. And what he's sort of saying there is a really interesting point here is that Jakobson, unlike Saussure gets people into all kinds of quagmires with his signifier and signified are arbitrary. No, Jakobson's able to show by analysis of lots of different languages that there is an internal motivation between signifier and signified at the conceptual level. And he also forces the issue that when he uses the word referent, he uses the word he used the word context to describe that function. That is, anytime you refer to anything, it always occurs in a context. So, I mean, he's able to say something like, there are unicorns. Unicorns exist in the fiction of the poets. Something like this, right? He's able to address that. But we do, as I say, you start to see, when we go to this, notice it's largely a horizontal structure, right? It's largely the horizontal. There's very little by way of the paradigmatic axis, whereas the Jakobson's full model, it's increasingly paradigmatic. That is, there's a much more vertical depth that's going on. That is, we're now, like, as we're standing here right now, we're like coagulated in the depth of the absent but possible. There's this huge absent but possible. Anything that you're hearing right now, you're imagining being able to put it into different words, say it otherwise, translate it. That's partly what is giving it this rich intersubjective depth and understanding. Okay, I'm getting to a couple of my last slides here. So this is where it gets, it gets really sort of over the top complex. This is some of the stuff that Richard Lanigan has done on the difference between communication and information. And what he wants to suggest is that information is always a subset of communication, and that information arises from selections within contexts of choice, constitutes probability differentiation by exclusion, and is formalized as either or both and. And he says that communication, it includes that but adds, right, the choice of context. So information gives you a context of choice. Think of a multiple choice test. There's the context. When you select an item, information is given. That's so different than an essay test where I say, here, begin by giving your interpretation of the question and then respond. Communication, again, includes choice of context, and it's often, as he says, it's a possibility differentiation by combination, which, as he says, could be formalized as both and either or. And so I think he would point to denotation has led many people into problematic either-or forms of thinking that he would say we need to step back and see some of the resources for using language in ways that bring out both and either-or. The thing that I would want to say here, and I'll sort of wrap up on this, is that the argument that I've been trying to go for, and this is over, I guess, many publications over years, but especially over these last two, is that people would do well to understand the difference between a phoneme and an alphabetic letter. A phoneme is highly context dependent. You could almost say it has zero identity. You get to morphemes and words, these kinds of lexical units, they do seem to have a kind of intelligible self-standing identity. Alphabetic letters are tricky. I guess as you move from, the Greeks sort of detached the letters from objects, and yet there was still an order to them, and we have a notion of B comes after A but before C, and these sensibilities have really shaped consciousness in so many ways, and they've really affected the way the paradigmatic axis works, right? Rather than things like rhyme and rhythm being the driver of the selection for the paradigmatic axis, we find more and more of it being driven off of visual biases, a sort of visual eidetic noetic, rather than just auditory noetic. And people would rely on letters, and this really came to a head in the mid-1800s with the push for universal spelling, right? Once, which William James was against, Mark Twain was against. They thought it would really impoverish people's sense of local community, some of the rangy playfulness of language. But I think it did have an effect. We can see right now the modern computer world would be almost impossible without the agreed upon spelling that we have. It sort of has created information systems. So if you want to say, how did we end up coming to imagine that when two people get together, they're just information sharing rather than animals co-negotiating a now? Well, they've fallen into history by falling into these two large axes of, again, paradigmatic and syntagmatic relationships, and then the paradigmatic axis has been fortified, grown, and I guess institutionalized through literacy. I was talking with Lance last night at dinner, and I said, my guess is he's read the dictionary quite a bit. And I said, so have I. My guess is many of us in here have spent lots of times reading the dictionary. And that, when you start to think about words as possible resources for employment, what you're really engaging in is something like a study of the history of consciousness itself. Okay, thank you.